Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have had on this podcast we started 17 years ago, some with ourselves, others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you enjoy them and want to support us and keep it all coming and get extra entertainment, including the weekly quiz and a special event on your birthday, visit patreon.com/word in your ear or just like or subscribe in whatever way you prefer. Do we need another book about the Beatles? The answer is, in this case, yes, we do, if it's this one. I've read maybe 40 books about the Beatles, and we both think this is really, really exceptional. It's called John and Paul, A Love Story and Songs, and it's by Ian Leslie. Ian, it's lovely to see you again.
Oh, lovely to see you, Mark, and David. Nice to be on the show.
Well, you were on the show last time, I think, when you just published your 64 Reasons to Celebrate Paul McCartney. Really, really original and insightful piece. Now, as regards the Beatles, Dave and I are old enough to have gone through the story chronologically, to have followed it chronologically. But when did you first encounter them? When did you first run into the Beatles?
So I'm kind of a typical Generation X. So I was born in the 70s, and my parents were not particularly into the Beatles, but like just about everyone else, they had Beatles records in the gramophone, and so they had Sergeant Pepper. The one I particularly remember is there was a collection called Beatles Oldies but Goldies.
Oh yeah.
Kind of early greatest hits collection, which came out in 1966, and it had this amazing psychedelic illustration, quasi-psychedelic illustration on the front, and a very cool photo of the Beatles sitting in a hotel room in Japan, on the back, and it had all their kind of a lot of their early hits. And for one thing, and looking back on it, it's so funny that they were already kind of talking about oldies but goldies, like this was some bygone era that they were recapturing.
Well, pop picking was a fast and furious business back then.
Yeah, it was. Well, and particularly the Beatles, they were kind of already moved on. But I really loved that LP. Then I started listening to Sgt. Pepper, and I was like, wow, that's weird. And really, from then on in, I became entranced by the story of the Beatles as well as the music. Maybe the story really happened later, because I think I read Philip Norman's Shout in the 1980s, and that. So I was interested enough to pick that up at the library and read it. And then once you've read it, once you've read about the Beatles, I think you kind of go, oh, well, that's it now. This is a good portion of my life that's just going to be devoted to thinking about them.
So describe the kind of at the angle of your book. To describe what the point of it, the frame of it was.
Well, it might be worth actually, seeing as you mentioned the 64 Reasons to Celebrate Paul McCartney piece, which the reason I was on the show last time, might be worth starting there, because it was not an obvious move for me in particular to write a book about the Beatles. And indeed, some people will say we don't need any more books about the Beatles and so on. I kind of felt the same way, except that I during lockdown, like a lot of people, I had some time in my hands and thought, well, I'll do one of those things I've never got around to doing, but always meant to. I'd been making notes towards this ridiculously long piece on Paul McCartney for years, thinking I need to say Paul McCartney's good. No one's ever said that before. But it was just a piece I needed to write and get off my chest. So I wrote it, 10,000 words, ridiculous. I didn't bother pitching it to any magazine. Who would want to publish that? But it went insanely viral. And the power and the scale of the response made me think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe I could write a book about the Beatles, because I've loved them for years. I'm fascinated by them. Why not? And pretty much at the same time as I had that thought, I knew I didn't want to just write a book of the blog post. I knew I wanted to write about John and Paul. In fact, when I was writing that long post, even though it's 10,000 words, I had to leave out quite a lot of material about the relationship with John because it was just expanding it into another universe. So I kind of had an idea. That's what I wanted to do. I just think they are the kind of, they are obviously the nucleus of the group. The chemistry between them is what started the group and remained the center of the group's, creativity. And the relationship between them is so complex and fascinated and conflicted that I was sort of amazed that there hasn't really been a major book about them. So I thought, why not? Why not just go for it?
And why do you think that the Beatles, you publish something about Paul McCartney or whatever, and you get enormous response? Why do you think that resonates so much more than, the Beach Boys or the Rolling Stones or just about anybody? Why does it resound so much, do you think?
Yeah, well, there's lots of ways to answer that question. I'm sure you have views on that as well. I'd say 2 or 3 things. One is that I think people recognize at some level, even if they don't articulate it, that they genuinely were in another class from everyone else. I know that lots of people will argue with me, but my feeling is that we're talking about, Shakespeare versus the other brilliant Elizabethan playwrights that are around. Ben Jonson and Marlowe, all incredibly good, but Shakespeare's on this another plane altogether. I feel a bit like that about the Beatles. So I think there's that. I think that they are such complex and interesting characters, and the relationship between them is so sort of interesting in a way that other relationships aren't. I think the fact that they kind of burst into flame and then flamed out after 7 years is incredibly important. There were no kind of like different members coming in and out, and a mediocre 1973 album where you think, well, these guys have lost it a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
The narrative comes to a definitive end in 1970 and at the turn of the decade. I mean, somebody was writing this story because it's almost too, so I think that's a big part of it. What I'd be interested to hear what you guys think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's because it's a story, isn't it? We can all hold it in our heads. You read Shout and thought, yeah, I can hold that in my head and just think about it for years and years and years, which is what we all do, isn't it? And no other group has got that kind of tidy story, it seems.
No, it's got a perfect beginning and ending, hasn't it? And they never get any older because it ended when they were young. Yeah. That mental image of them as young, permanently young, is very important. But also, I think, is that the more you scratch the surface of the Beatles, the more you investigate them, every single aspect of what you look at, their story, their personalities, their characters, the quality of the songs, the songwriting, the composition, becomes more and more interesting. The recording, there's just more and more detail. Every single thing they did had huge dimensions to it, which are just eternally fascinating. It just carries on being rewarding, doesn't it?
I agree, and I don't want to be too gushing, but it's a bit pointless now. I might as well. But it also gets more amazing and more mysterious. I keep thinking, I don't keep thinking, but I did think at one stage, if I read too much about the detail of the Beatles story and how they made the music and everything, it will become less kind of astonishing and it will become a little bit more ordinary. And it's completely the opposite. The deeper you go, the more mysterious it gets. I still don't really understand. I don't really believe on some level that they made Rubber Soul, in the middle of the frenzy of touring and production. There's a great, Rick Rubin cute quote where he says something like, the Beatles, and I think he talked about Rubber Soul in particular, but you could pick your album or your moment, is the best argument for God that I know of. Because you're like, this couldn't have happened. This shouldn't have happened. So yeah, it gets more and more interesting, and it also gets more and more amazing.
One of the things that you kind of built the book around is the idea that two completely different views of John and Paul developed. And they developed really almost immediately after John had died. In fact, you start with the bit where McCartney's being interviewed by the press. And you think that at that point he's already realised that John is going to be canonised, as it were. And that John's going to be the kind of, I think you put it as the tormented anti-establishment hero, and Paul's going to be seen as the bourgeois poser with no substance. Now that pattern did develop for years. So what caused that to happen? What caused those divisions? John being this kind of utter genius and McCartney being this kind of superficial chancer. What was behind that?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, a few things. One was his horrible early death, right? I mean, just the fact of what became a kind of martyrhood meant that he was already kind of associated with causes, even though there was actually a relatively brief period of his life. You know, he was a political activist really for only 3 or 4 years, maybe. And, you know, the amazing thing about John was that he was always kind of switching, doing different things and getting obsessed by different things. That was one of his obsessions, to some extent an enduring one, but it was only one part. But anyway, that becomes magnified after his death. But also it started even earlier than that, because there was a kind of generation of rock critics in the 70s who really constructed the narrative of the Beatles, and to them Lennon was the great creative soul and genius of the group. He was the really difficult one, the tormented one, fitted our ideas of what a genius should be like. He gave the most amazing interviews. This should not be underrated. You know, he made this kind of jab at McCartney as a great PR man, which really stuck. But John was an incredible PR man for himself. He and Yoko gave hundreds of interviews around the break, after the breakup, in the aftermath, first couple of years of the 70s. And he was this incredibly compelling, funny, seemingly completely honest and authentic interviewee, even though actually now we look at them and go, he was making lots of stuff up. He was contradicting himself. He was lying. I mean, he admitted to lying later on. So he wasn't as honest as he seemed. But to these guys, and understandably, it was like hearing the Godhead speak. He was incredible, you know, incredibly charismatic figure. So he became central to their kind of the narrative of the Beatles. There became this idea that he was the creative kind of soul of the Beatles. McCartney was this brilliant musician, melodist, and cute looking guy. But Lennon was the real soul of the Beatles. And then that was exacerbated when he was assassinated, and then it was exacerbated again by Philip Nillman's brilliant, very successful narrative of the group, which put John absolutely at the center of the group and really kind of downplayed Paul's influence. So that from that point on, really, I think the narrative was kind of set in stone, and that lasted for decades, and there are still kind of residual elements of it around today.
One of the things that struck me in your book, which had been staring me in the face for God knows how long, and I'd never fully taken it on board, is that when they started writing songs together, they were a really rare case of a songwriting partnership who both wrote words and music.
Yeah.
There's hardly any cases of that before them. Rodgers and Hart a little bit, apparently. Hardly any other cases. Lieber and Stoller didn't. You know, one wrote the words, they wrote like Elton John and Bernie Taupin, which is a totally different way of writing songs, isn't it? Whereas if you've got two guys who can both supply music and words, you've got a fundamentally different way of writing songs, haven't you? That seems to be the case, do you think?
Totally agree. And you say staring you in the face, and that's exactly my feeling. And actually, you know, not just that, about a lot of the Beatles story, you actually go, this is kind of obvious, but yes. We're so used to it now that actually it's crazy. You know, they themselves said that the model they had for this partnership, which, you know, why should they have a partnership? They were in a group with two others, and you know, but they decided it was just those two. And they talked about Rodgers and Hammerstein. You know, they were nothing like Rodgers and Hammerstein. Like you say, they both wrote words, they both wrote music, and they played instruments. Rodgers and Hammerstein, they were not picking up the clarinet or
they weren't saying like this, were they?
Yeah.
Whereas Lennon and McCartney were doing this. They were saying, I'm going to add something now that is going to give this song another lift in the middle or something like that. And you can hear that in their records. And it doesn't apply in anybody else's records, it seems to me.
You can hear that they were writing it to be played live at first and then recorded.
Yeah.
So they were writing these songs and they were thinking, like, how are we going to perform this? Up until that stage, certainly most songwriting partnerships weren't doing that. And even after that stage, as you say, most songwriting partnerships divided into words and music. There just wasn't that division at all. So it was incredibly unusual at the time. And even today, even after they kind of created this new model, it's still quite unusual.
It is. It is. And the other thing, of course, is staring you in the face, which, it comes through Mark Lewison's first book about the Beatles, is the question everybody asked them when they came to London is, who's the leader? And they said, well, we don't have a leader. And that's the fundamental thing about them. They don't have a leader. They're a group.
And I did. That was a lesson I took from Mark Lewison.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a really interesting one. That the model was Cliff and the Shadows. It was always X and the Y.
Yeah. Yes.
And there was a lot of pressure on them to be Johnny and the Moondogs, Johnny and whatever. And they always resisted it. John was never. It's so interesting that John was this, on the one hand, dominant alpha male and liked to project his personality and charisma. On the other hand, never really wanted to be the guy, and was always happier to have an equal. Paul was pretty much the only one he regarded as an equal next to him, and that just created a very different model of the group. And again, even though we can, they invented this new model, it's still actually quite unusual for a group to be so, democratic in that sense.
No, sure.
But you pick on various points throughout the book where Lennon doesn't want to be the leader, but likes to still think of himself as a leader in a way. It's like when right at the very beginning, when he recruits Paul McCartney to the Quarrymen, there's a part of him that's worrying that he's now going to be threatened, that his authority is going to be threatened. And that kind of appears throughout the book, him going on the holiday with Brian Epstein, a complicated story in itself. But, partly that was, McCartney thought, was for him to remind Epstein that he was the leader. So do you think, you talk about Yesterday as being a key moment. Do you think that the arrival of the song Yesterday was a big pivot where he felt quite threatened and thought, actually, this guy is absolutely extraordinary talent?
Yeah, I mean, and we could go very deep on this and talk about it for hours because it's such a fascinating dynamic, isn't it? Lennon himself is so conflicted about it, I think. On the one hand, he's very proud of the fact that it is his group. He started it. On the other hand, he doesn't really push himself forward. He doesn't say, right, it's got to be me and you guys. I think that's partly because he didn't want to, partly because he knew that Paul would never stand for it, right? I'm not sure what the kind of proportions are there. But when McCartney really kind of, he was still kind of relatively, Lennon was relatively dominant in the early 60s years, the first 2 or 3 albums. And he has a larger share of the songs. McCartney's scoring some big number one singles, and he's not doing badly. But Lennon is probably more creatively adventurous at that time. But McCartney's talent and confidence kind of takes off like a rocket, really, between, I don't know, kind of 1964 and 1966. And around 1965, where he writes Yesterday, and it unexpectedly becomes this huge hit. I think that was around the moment when McCartney himself was like, wow, I've got superpowers. And Lennon was like, oh my God. I think he felt I think he thought, either this guy's going to overwhelm me kind of overwhelm me within the group. Or maybe this guy will go off and leave. And John was somebody who was always terrified that people were going to up and leave him because
absolutely, yes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
His childhood.
Yeah.
So I think that led to this kind of slightly tortured relationship. But a very creatively tortured relationship with McCartney.
Oh, yes.
A decade.
But you mentioned that when he writes Imagine later on, he says, someone says, oh, this is really good. He said, but is it as good as Yesterday? So he was obviously plagued by this. And
He's
then there's
absolutely obsessed by Yesterday. Yeah, it's incredible. It's like
I know.
It's back to it like an itch. He's got a scratch. And he keeps saying, in interviews, he said, like, well, of course, it's not that great a song. Doesn't really kind of resolve properly. And
the great irony is he's making 50% of the money from it, isn't he?
That's a great point.
Which must be a strange feeling. I had nothing to do with this, and I've got millions of pounds from it.
Yeah,
it's an extraordinary thing. Well, one of the things I like about the book is, you concentrate on various songs, various incidents, and there's stuff that we kind of know about, but you've sort of, again, it's in plain sight. You have to really think about it. The incident at Paul McCartney's, was it his 21st birthday? In Liverpool,
the fight
where Lennon attacks, is it Alan Williams?
Bob
Wooler, sorry, Liverpool figure, and this is just after he's gone away with Brian Epstein, just after the birth of his child. It's just there's a fist fight. He thinks he's killed him at first, and he thinks this is the end of everything. It's extraordinary how the Beatles' story is just strewn with those kind of amazing dramas, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And a couple of things about that. Number one, I sort of always wondered, like, why do a lot of Beatles biographies and so on spend so much time on John and so much time on little time on Paul? And I think I wanted to rebalance that. But on the other hand, I kind of understood it afterwards because John is so messed up in so many different ways. There's so much going on in his life. You kind of have to cover quite a lot of it. So that incident, I think, is an example of how unstable John was. Again, slightly underrated. What a mess he was, and how difficult it was to manage him. There's a great interview with Amy Mann, the singer-songwriter, that the One Sweet Dream podcast did with her in the wake of the Get Back documentary. They had a chat about the film. She's really interesting and insightful, particularly because she's thinking about it in terms of working with other musicians and being in groups and so on. And one thing struck me from that conversation was she said, I just think in any other group, John would have been out. Don't care how good you are, we're going to get. And she could see how hard Paul was working. This is in 1969, obviously, keeping him in. And I think that's true throughout the 60s. And we slightly underestimate it, that John and the others, Paul and the others, and Brian and so on, was working really hard to keep this crazy guy like inside the tent. Partly because they wanted the group to work, partly because they loved him and they knew he was happier when he was making music.
Well, allowing Yoko's hospital bed to be moved into the Abbey Road studio is a really good example of that. I can remember thinking, I cannot think of anything more intrusive to the delicate creative nucleus of making music than having her sitting there stealing all George Harrison's biscuits, and it's just, you think they accommodated that. It's astonishing.
I agree. I think the narrative has swung slightly too far from Yoko split up the Beatles, it's all her fault, which is obviously wrong, to, oh my God, these guys were all sexist and they couldn't handle the fact that John having no, there's an in-between here, which is like weird, that is. And then I actually think you could see it in the Get Back film. They were working, including Paul, they were working very hard to accommodate, Yoko.
Do you ever think that, do you reflect while doing this book about the fact that they came from a different generation? Nowadays, groups probably have kind of intimacy counselors and, consultants come in. Well, Metallica did this, didn't they? They couldn't get on, so they sat there with a counselor for about a year until they could get on. And one of the things that amazes me about the Beatles is you look back on them and you hardly ever see a picture of them physically touching each other. there's no arms around each other as everybody has nowadays at the end of shows and so forth. There's no outward displays of affection. And yet one of your points of your book is there was a profound affection within the group. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there is a shot in Get Back of John kind of drawing the others into a hug, and we all got incredibly excited by it. And
this is so rare.
It's so rare. You're completely right, and I hadn't noticed that. I haven't quite crystallized that in my head. But you're right. You don't see them hugging, on stage. You don't see them high-fiving or whatever.
They were like their fathers. They were stiff upper lip in many ways. All that unfreezing took place as a consequence of what they did. It wasn't there at the time.
And I think particularly when we're thinking about John and Paul, that the fruits of that male emotional repression are the songs to some extent.
Yes.
I'm like, thank God for male repression, because otherwise we have, because so much of the affection and the emotion and the intensity and the conflicted feelings goes into the music. It's not talked out with Intimacy Council. It's not made mundane and kind of comprehensible. A lot of the feelings about each other, it's not just what they were. Obviously, they had feelings for all sorts of other people, but within the group, those feelings express themselves in this amazing music. So,
But that's so true about the physical kind of signs of affection. But there are brilliant moments in the book where you talk about just how close they were, and you're making the point that telepathic understanding of each other and the way their minds worked is what informed so much of the creative process of the Beatles. There's a lovely bit where they go on holiday. I think it's John's 21st birthday, and he inherits £100, huge amount of money, equivalent to £2,000, and decides to spend it on taking McCartney to Paris. And they go off, the two of them, don't they, wearing bowler hats, and just become even more closely bonded. And I think you talk about the Hard Day's Night set where Paul and John would go off into these little riffs together, where George and Ringo would often just kind of back away because they were just in another world. Their relationship was so close.
Exactly. There were a kind of bubble within the bubble, right? So the whole very close, and then there was this kind of inner bubble. It's fascinating. If you think about just going back to them forming their songwriting partnership, if you think about how exposing it is to A, sing in front of somebody, and B, share your creative ideas with somebody. Say you write a song, you write a poem, a lot of people have done this at some stage. Showing it to somebody is really kind of terrifying to do.
You're so vulnerable.
So
exposed.
And this when they were teenagers, right? Almost, very soon after they meet, they start doing this. So, and you have the background, obviously, of what's going on in their families, and they're both bereaved and so on, and they are being very vulnerable, effectively, not through the process of therapy or whatever, but through songwriting, and letting each other in from very early on. So actually, they are bonded, kind of, at every level, from when they're very young, and then so that's how that kind of inner bubble kind of forms within the group. It's through the creative process.
Right.
And also you say that their songs, a lot of them are about, they're a means of communication, aren't they? The songs are often about making an emotional point rather than just telling a story, which is interesting.
And I think that's true of both of them. People used to think about John that way, but I think there's a lot of examples of Paul doing it as well. And although they wrote about all sorts of things and wrote about their feelings for different people, a lot of the songs are about each other or influenced by, what's going on in the relationship at that time. We know the obvious examples, like How Do You Sleep? But it's interesting that a lot of attention has been paid to the examples of where they're being hostile to each other in songs. Less attention gets paid to the songs where I think they're being more affectionate to each other.
Which are those songs, do you think, particularly?
Well, I mean, I kind of make the case, and none of this is clear cut, by the way, because songs are always about more than one. Well, their songs are about one thing at once. So it's not a kind of crude reductionist approach, but in My Life, I think at least can be read. I think at one level it's about Paul. I don't think Paul realised that for a moment, but I think there's a kind of like you're the constant here, no matter what the changes that we've been through. Mm-hmm. I think a jealous guy, just moving later on, is, well, John apparently told Paul it was about him. This Hey Jude obviously is an example as well, where Paul, well, that's about several different things, is why it's such an amazing song, but Paul's singing to John, he's also singing to himself, and he's also saying, to both of them, really, we've got to go out and get her, we've got to kind of move our different ways and do so lovingly. So I don't know. As you know, there's plenty more examples in the book, and I could kind of talk about them for ages. But there's always not always, but there's often some sort of negotiation going on, or some message of love, or something else going on in the songs.
Did they miss each other in the 70s, apart from creatively? Did they miss each other personally?
Yeah, I think so. I think they missed their easy intimacy. And so actually, they after their bitter kind of falling out, first couple of years, they actually resolve it, at least superficially, fairly quickly. So people kind of think, oh, they hated each other throughout the 70s. Not really true. They kind of get together in 1972, and everything calms down. They meet with their wives and so on. And then throughout the 70s, they talk on the phone quite a lot. Paul goes to visit John quite a few times with families, right? So they don't spend any time, just the two of them, or not much time that we know of. And they don't write together. That was the big thing. I think they were kind of edging towards that. And there were moments when that looked like it might happen. Like, for example, 1973, 1974, John, when Paul goes to New Orleans and says, do you want to come down and hang out with me in this great musical city? And John's up for it. But then he goes back to Yoko, and Yoko's not very keen on that. So there were moments when they get close to it, but they never kind of recapture their old intimacy. And I think they both really missed that creatively and personally, yes.
I think the book makes it so clear that what an agonizing situation it was when the group split up, because they were so close before they were successful anyway. Hamburg, and the early tours and all that. Then the success comes and they're imprisoned by that and become even closer. And then they break up, and they're then forced not only to have a life without each other, but to be set up against each other competitively, where they're sitting there watching each other's particular individual successes or failures. And you just think this is quadruply agonizing. It must have been such a difficult time.
Yeah. And you could see how much they all sort of relied on Paul to make them productive as well.
That's the thing. That's the thing. In all groups, there's one member who goes, let's do this. And that's the member that everybody else hates. Yeah. Because they know somebody has to do it, but they're damn glad it's not them. So he's the one going, I suggest we do Magical Mystery Tour or whatever. And then when it goes wrong, they say, well, it was your fault.
It was your fault. And you get the impression they're all lying around on sun lounges when he's up in London, and they're just dreading the phone ringing, and it's going to be Paul wanting them to go back.
This is what Ringo always says. That's why we did so much. Paul was always on the phone. He was always the one saying, let's do something, The rest of them would have just sat around.
And they rewarded him by bitching about him for the.
But it happens in every work situation that I've ever been involved in. It's always the same. People resent the person who suggests. But every organization relies on somebody who suggests. They won't always suggest right, but they will suggest. And I think you find it in every band, certainly in every band I'm aware of.
Agreed. Yeah, and every workplace.
It's like Mick's the one in the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
The rest of the Rolling Stones resent Mick for being Mick. But they'd be bloody stuck without Mick.
Yeah, they'd be playing the Hammersmith Odeon if it wasn't for him.
Yeah, sorry.
Was there a period, the bit where Paul is the only one in London, they've all kind of moved out into the suburbs and lying around in their gardens drinking beer and smoking dope, and he's the avant-garde one, isn't he? And he's going to the Indica bookshop and he's going to the art galleries, he's making the tape loops and all that. But was Lennon kind of undermined by that? Was he threatened by that? Because he still managed to give the impression that he was the avant-garde one.
Yes. I think, well, I don't know, actually. Maybe. I think there was a little bit of him. Yeah, I think he probably was. But I also thought he had this kind of competing vision of what it meant to be a creative person in a way, an alternative vision, which was actually, instead of running around endlessly being busy, going to all these festivals and gigs and meeting people and so on, you could just lie on the sofa, take a tab of LSD or smoke marijuana and go into the vast depths of your unconscious and just chill out and just like, stuff will come to you. And it's true, right? Like he did that. Right? The songs are the evidence of it. But so there becomes this kind of interesting tension from the mid-60s onwards, where Paul is like this incredibly, like unbelievably busy, omnivorous culturevore, just sucking everything up. And John is kind of like almost horizontal when he's not having to work. And they're both models they both work, right? But they're both also getting slightly, there's a kind of tension between those two things. And I think they kind of lean into that tension as the 60s go. I'm Only Sleeping is a kind of great defense of
absolutely.
Well, you can see this again in Get Back, can't you? That Paul turns up every day with pretty much complete songs. And John and George have a little bit of a song, and they desperately want him to help them, complete the thing, which is an extraordinary relationship, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. I mean, it must have been terrifying. I have so much sympathy for Lennon in 1969. We look at that in Get Back and we say, oh, this poor guy's in a creative slump. This guy just done most, like, a few months before the White Album had come out, right?
Yes,
so many amazing songs on that album, and he was still, Don't Let Me Down and whatever else he comes up with. Like, they're pretty great songs. But he looks like he's in a slump because he's next to Paul McCartney, and Paul McCartney's hurling song after song after song.
Also, Paul McCartney's coming in with the songs completely written in his head, isn't he? He's got the whole arrangement. There's a bit, I think it might be Maxwell's Silver Hammer, where he just goes through it and he plays his bit, and you do this on the bass and you do that. And he said, at the end he goes, and that's Maxwell, and he's kind of gone through the whole thing. He could hear the whole song. That must have been so frustrating for them. They must have been grateful, but also threatened by it,
No, I think it must have been psychologically punishing.
Yes.
But particularly John. It was like, oh my God, what? I can't do this like in the way that he can do it. So in a way, I admire them for just getting through that. The other thing I wanted to say about the kind of Paul staying in London whilst the others move out to the country.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a really significant split, really in the group, and actually one of the things that struck me as I wrote the book was Paul was always slightly isolated. Not isolated, it's not the right word, but there's always a sense that it was Paul and the other guys, right? So even in the early bit when they meet Epstein, they all go to meet Epstein for the first important meeting with Epstein, and Paul turns up 3 hours late. I mean, deliberately, right?
Yes.
Driving Epstein mad, driving the others mad, completely stupid thing, terrible thing to do. And it was a way of him kind of reasserting his status, because he thought John's guy. I mean, I think he changed his mind about that to some extent, but he thought Brian was John's guy. And so Paul was always kind of pulling a little bit at the edge of the group. I think John noticed that, and I think John was always kind of trying to manage that and was worried that Paul was actually going to split altogether. So I think that kind of dynamic of Paul kind of pulling a little bit on the leash and saying, well, actually, I'm not quite ready to go with what you all guys think. I've got my own views. You see that all the way through, right to the split, when Paul kind of says, oh, we think we should go with the Eastmans, and the other three all say, I'm going with Klein. So there was always this kind of dynamic all the way through.
Yeah. So what's your personal favourite bit of the book? It must be some kind of anecdote or incident or something that you think illuminates particularly their relationship that you'd like people to take notice of?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to it. It's good because this is, I think, the first sort of proper conversation I've had about it. So you're gonna this is good training for me. David, I'm so glad you asked that.
Nursery slopes.
Media training.
Media training. I'm getting media trained on the spot.
That's what your do word in your ear first and get your arguments in line, and then
think of
Sunday Times.
Think of something.
I think I do have sort of favourite chapters.
Go on.
I love my own work, but I do love the Hey Jude chapter because there's so much going on. And in particular, they're both deciding that Yoko and Linda, respectively, are the loves of their lives, and that and kind of knowing at some level that means a big change, maybe the end of the relationship, at least in the same way, and maybe the end of the group. It's a real kind of turning point, I think, that. And I was capturing all that and showing how much emotion and how much complexity went into that song, and hoping what I want to do is for people to hear this song that they've heard a million times and probably bored of and don't like, to go back and listen to it again and go, wow, there's just so much emotion in there. So I think that was for me a kind of like one of the pivotal points in the story.
And from all the work and research you put into doing the book, at the end of it, was there something that you felt had made you look at the group in a different way? Something you'd learned about them that had never dawned on you before? Again,
another question I should have.
Another media training question. Yes.
Well, I don't know, but okay, I'll give you one answer to that. It's related to what I've just said. Not so much about the group, I suppose, but about the way the relationship played out. Is that I'd always thought that basically what happens is they are very close, then they grow up a bit, they meet Yoko and Linda, they meet these women, they both fall in love, and Paul talks about this wedding bells, and they kind of go, so that they kind of split apart. No, I think it's slightly the other way around. Having looked at it a bit more closely, and you can see I'm kind of quite careful in looking at the chronology of the relationships they have with Yoko and Linda from when they meet to when they decide to get married. I now think that they, at some level, needed to disentangle themselves from each other and chose to fall in love with Linda and Yoko. Do you see what I mean?
Right. Okay.
But actually, it wasn't an immediate kind of, coup de foudre and a kind of like, oh, I'm in love with this woman and now I must kind of extract myself a little bit, from this relationship. I think it was the other way around. If you look at John and Yoko, they knew each other for a long time before they do kind of get together and fall in love.
Same with Paul and Linda, actually.
And the same with Paul and Linda.
Paul would carry on with lots of other relationships.
Carrying on with women, right
until the very end.
Overlapping with Linda, and there's a lot going on there. And I'm not like for a moment saying they didn't love these women, because look at Paul in particular, is completely close to the rest of her life. And John and Yoko, for all their ups and downs, remained close at the when he died, but I don't think it was just an act of falling in love. I think it was like them kind of saying, right, okay, I need to find a way out. This is the way out. This woman is great. I'm going for it.
Well, there you are.
It's a really terrific book.
We'll leave it there. The conversation will continue. The thinking about John and Paul and the Beatles will continue. Further generations of authors, I'm sure. Authors not yet born.
Yeah, exactly. When people say, do we really need another Beatles book? I'm like, we have only just begun.
Absolutely. Exactly. We're just in the nursery slopes.
Yeah, brace yourselves. It's just started. It's a fantastic edition, and it's a wonderful book.